Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're just waiting for 1 minute and then we kick off our discussion. So please bear with us until more people can join us. Or actually, we still have one speaker who will join us shortly as well. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamil Mawad. I'm a senior fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today. As you know, this webinar is entitled Knowledge as a Public Good, What Knowledge Do Humanitarian and Development Agencies Produce in the MENA region. This is a webinar that opens up a series on knowledge production in the Arab world within the framework of a project conducted by ARI on knowledge production and what impact it does have on what we call public policy, but not only public policy from rather a state-centric approach, but also what knowledge does have on public debates as well. So this is a project that has two pillars. One is a pillar where we train young researchers on the techniques, but also on the different frameworks of public policies. And another pillar where we invite scholars either to write chapters or like this webinar today, where we're exploring different angles through which we can have the impact that knowledge has on public policy in the region, or even public debates, as I just said. Today, the topic is, I believe, interesting and original because often we think we look at knowledge as the privileged domain of scholars or academia, or even recently civil society activists that are trying to produce knowledge that has an impact on the public sphere. But there is also another dimension of this knowledge in the Arab world or the MENA region, where international organizations are also producing knowledge with the aim also to impact policies in the region. And this aspect is often overlooked. And that's why in our webinar today, we try to put it center stage in the discussion and bring the knowledge that is often produced by international organizations, humanitarian or not, into the discussion. So joining us today are three speakers. Actually, we have two, and another speaker hopefully will be joining us soon. So first we have Farah Sher. Thanks, Farah, for joining us. Farah is an economist by training, and she has 15 years of experience working with leading research centers and development agencies such as the UNDP, the World Bank, and the Lebanese Ministry of Finance, in addition to the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Thanks, Farah, for joining us. Then we have Ola Sidani. Also, thanks, Ola, for joining us today. Ola is a development economist, scholar, and practitioner, and she's an expert in international cooperation and public policy. She has worked for the UNDP at the Office of the Prime Minister in Lebanon. And in addition, we also have Mr. Asad Al-Ashi, who will be joining us soon, hopefully, who's a Syrian economist and civil society activist. And he's currently the executive director of Baytna, a civil society support mechanisms, providing grants, capacity building, and networking or advocacy opportunities. So again, thanks for attending. I just have one thing to tell you. This is a webinar where speakers will be speaking either in English or in Arabic, and there is an interpretation, translation. So joining us is Nagam Khairallah, who's going to help us today in interpreting either from English into Arabic or from Arabic into English. Thanks, Naham, for being with us and for your time as well. So speakers will have between 10 and 15 minutes presentations each, and then we'll move to the Q's and A's. For those of you who have questions, please write them down on the chat box, and we'll make sure to transfer them to the speakers. We're live on Facebook as well, and if you would like to tweet, you're free to do this. So please, Farah, you go first, and then possibly Ola, and later on Asad. Farah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jamil, for the introduction and for the invite. I also wish to thank the Arab Reform Initiative, Nadim Houri. Thank you for also facilitating this open space for all of us to reflect on some of the work that we were once engaged in. And also to think with other colleagues and other friends as well on an issue that is very dear to me. So until recently, until end 2023, I was part of the regional program at UNDP, and I've led and taken part in various initiatives that aim primarily at producing knowledge for the Arab region, whether it was data, big data focused, but also facilitating access to data for citizens and empowering national producers of data and knowledge in the Arab region. So my intervention today is basically a combination of my personal reflection and insights that I've gathered for almost 15 years, being part of various UN agencies, the World Bank, etc. But also it is also an analysis of a preliminary mapping that I've conducted, which made use of open source public publications, reference documents that are actually published by UN organizations themselves, by IFIs as well, the World Bank, etc. I think we tend to overlook these publications. We tend to assume that knowledge on these organizations is somewhere else. It is somewhere in the academic field, which tends to be critical of the work of these organizations. But what you will see with me now is that, the organizations themselves are very clear about what they do. They are quite transparent about the knowledge that they have been producing. Now, whether this knowledge serves the public good, whether this knowledge in itself is a public good, is something that is up for us to actually discuss and eventually answer. So my intervention will be looking at a very specific statement that came in the introduction of this webinar. So the nature of the international or universal frameworks, their relevance and connectedness to national realities. But then first, for me, there are three important entry points. And so I haven't yet developed an analytical framework. I think part of what we're doing here is to agree on a framework that would help us assess the knowledge produced by UN agencies, by development agencies, and others as well. So the first entry point for me will be, how do these producers of knowledge introduce and define the knowledge they produce? So the objectives, the target audience, etc. And then a second entry point is whether the produced knowledge is meeting the predetermined objectives. So actually to hold them accountable to the knowledge that they themselves claimed and stated that they will be producing. And then a third entry point is on the politics of knowledge. So whose interest is this knowledge serving? So relevant to who and for what? And here I would claim that timing is key, because we don't have one knowledge. What the UN used to produce is different. At times of polarization, at times of political instability, at times, after the Arab Spring, the nature of knowledge changed by the UN and others as well. So timing is key, the political moment is key. And then a second interlinked point that I wish to raise is relevance and connectedness to national realities, which I claim is a double-edged sword. Sometimes catering to national reality will not really serve the public good. So catering to the political reality, catering to governments, to parliamentarians, etc., might not be to the beneficiary of, to the benefit of the public good. So this is, and this is something that is not hidden. So this is something that, for example, is part of the quality assurance production process that UNDP has published online for everyone to see. And it has adopted a risk log framework. Part of the risk log framework is a political risk. So they take into consideration government commitment, political will, political instability, change, turnover in government. So knowledge production has to be assessed from a realist lens. And then according to the quality standards as well, which are used to screen what goes published and what doesn't go published by UNDP, for example, the first point is that it has to be relevant to the organization's or program's priorities. So here the language is very clear. We're talking about an agency that is producing knowledge to serve its own priorities. Now, of course, these priorities are part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and which claims to leave no one behind. So ultimately, ideally, these priorities aim to serve an agenda that is inclusive and an agenda that is serving the global public good, which is also, of course, catered to national priorities. Now, the World Bank, and to the credit of the World Bank, is actually much more transparent. I mean, it's not much more transparent, but they have done their own exercise in terms of also conducting a mapping across. This was conducted in 2014, which looked into the nature of knowledge produced and its use as well. So, for example, some of the findings of this report, also available online, is that 49% of the World Bank's policy reports are downloaded, and 30% of policy reports were downloaded at least 250 times, and then more than 31% of policy reports are never downloaded, and that it's 1/4 of its budget is actually dedicated to knowledge production. But then another interesting finding, I mean, it's not really a finding, it's out there in the document itself, which actually says that 8% of these knowledge products aim to serve the public good. And who gets the highest share? It's external clients, 77%. So a second finding is that the World Bank's knowledge products isn't necessarily serving the public good. This is not my statement. This is what I infer from a publication that is published by the World Bank and is part of the World Bank Quarterly Business and Risk Review. So part of their objective is that, yes, we produce knowledge. This knowledge may be available as a public good, but not necessarily. Now, a second interesting finding, which relates to the analytical framework, whether it's universal or not, etc. Now, a second finding also from a very interesting report, which was conducted by UNESCO on the World Bank, focusing on education, and it looked into 77 publications that are specifically related to education. One of, for me, a surprising finding is that 54% of studies lack a theoretical orientation, and then 44% of studies, they lack a methodological strategy. So in a way, they are not really anchored in any universal framework. And this is something that we also need to take into consideration. At the UN, there is this recent trend whereby the theory of change is dominating knowledge production. It is an operational theory of change, which looks into focus, which looks into interventions, whether these interventions would actually stir change across various sectors. They take into consideration, risks, etc. But it is not really it is not an analytical framework. It is an operational framework that is trying to push for change in different directions. But the nature of this change is also something that we need to take into consideration. But unfortunately, this dominance of a theory of change is coming at the expense of academic knowledge production. So the link with academia is becoming weaker and weaker. Now, also, a third interesting finding is what I call a distorted bottom-up approach. So sometimes knowledge production comes not, the causality is there is distorted. It comes after an intervention or a program has been designed. So in a way, commissioning research that it then cites to justify the promotion of its preferred programs and policies. This is one. And this is across research, across general publications, etc. And here, whether again, knowledge production. If we look into the politics of knowledge production, I think this is a very useful finding to help us think about the use of knowledge production, and then also the timing. And the fourth important finding that I also gathered is that the political moment is decisive, and this is something that I started with. Of course, these organizations have their, they're not independent research centers. They never claim that they are independent research centers. They have an agenda, which is also a public agenda. They deal with member states, and this ecosystem of knowledge production, of course, shapes the nature of knowledge that is being produced, and the groups that this knowledge will be eventually serving. So, but then, because especially after the Arab Spring, and you could easily witness that in Lebanon now, sometimes knowledge production is being shaped and is a reflection of the dominant narrative. So, we've all seen this report by the World Bank being quoted by leftist economists, by the most progressive activists in the country. This was a report that was considered revolutionary by everyone. Now, this report was also, as in the acknowledgement section, you could see that this report was itself also drafted by an activist/economist by Dr. Sharb El-Nahas. And this is why here, knowledge, and why I was saying that knowledge changes, the nature of knowledge changes. It does reflect political moments. And it is at these moments when we also, probably, as a group that is interested in the public good, these are important moments that we can capitalize on. And a final point that I'm also making is this, this assumption that, okay, we need development agencies to actually cater to national realities. I'm saying this is a double-edged sword, because this is the 2030 agenda. This is the official document. The 2030 agenda, for those of you who are not familiar with, it is the agenda that has been adopted by the UN and 193 member states in September 2015, and which actually is the overarching agenda that dominates, that guides the work of the UN agencies in all countries. But this agenda itself, and this is positive. It can be seen as positive, but then it can be seen as negative. It calls, for implementation. It asks of countries, of UN country teams to take into account different national realities. It says that the UN will respect national policy space, in particular for developing states. And for me, this is where it becomes tricky, while remaining consistent with relevant international rules and commitments. And we have seen, and this is part of the implementation section, focusing on the policy space of each country and respecting the essential role of national parliaments. So in countries, in regions where national parliaments, the legitimacy of national parliaments is under question. Catering to the needs of national realities become a very gray zone that will not necessarily serve the public good, and by default would make of knowledge produced within this framework knowledge that is not serving the public good. And then a fifth and final finding, I'll be ending here, relates to the future of knowledge debate. So I don't know, I felt the urge to actually talk to ChatGPT during the preparation for this webinar. And probably I shouldn't have, I should have tried to look into what kind of knowledge it will consolidate across the globe, and also probably from the region if I asked it in Arabic. But then there is an ongoing debate on the future of knowledge. And unfortunately, by some UN agencies, this debate is being hijacked by a debate on digitalization and technical progress. And I think there is a need for all of us here, for this platform, to look into the relevance of the future of knowledge debates on the knowledge as and for public good. At times where this debate is being hijacked by, technological progress, AI, big data, etc. I'm afraid that then the agenda to actually support and capacitate knowledge production in the region, for example, will be reduced to an agenda that is focusing on digitalization. And I think this is very dangerous for various reasons that we can then discuss in the Q&A. Thank you, Jamil. Thank you.
Excellent, Farah. Thanks for this very clear and well-structured presentation, but also most importantly, eye-opening to the infrastructure of knowledge production in these international organizations, whether in terms of relevance, in terms of transparency, in terms of the tension or not between the international frameworks and local and national needs or realities. So I'm sure it will leave us with many questions. But now we'll move to our second presentation by Asad Al-Ashir. Asad, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jamil, and thank you for the Arab Reform Initiative for the invite. It's very hard to come after Farah and try to look at the question of knowledge, but I'll be looking at it from a different perspective, not from a UN/international organizations perspective, but more from a local grassroots perspective. And I'll be looking at three things. Where is knowledge produced? At what level? Who is producing knowledge at that level? Second, what kind of quality are we getting? And third, which is a big question today, what is the legitimacy of that knowledge that is being produced at the grassroots level, in the sense that how is it accepted? How is it perceived? And is it always being dismissed as a political tool rather than legitimate research, legitimate information? And when we look at grassroots organizations, and I'll be more specifically looking at Syria, the country I come from and the country that I work in or work on. When we look at Syria, for the past 15 years, at the beginning, most of the knowledge or most of the information was produced by what we call tansiqiyat, or the different coordination committees at the beginning of the uprising that were generating, all the media attention, but also all the research production that was made in the first 3 years of the uprising. We also have some of the Syrian research centers, and I can name the Syrian Center for Policy Research. There is also a couple of Amran Study Center established in Istanbul. There are a couple more that look at Jusur, for example, that look at you look at it from a research center perspective, from a think tank perspective. So that I'll be putting that aside as well and looking really at what civil society grassroots has produced. And the first thing they've produced is, all the monitoring and evaluation reports, all the reporting that they generate to donors, which has a lot of information. But that information is only fed upstream to the donor, is never shared publicly, and is never actually shared downstream either with the beneficiaries. So the beneficiaries will never know really what kind of impact are we reporting up to our donors. They're just really recipients of whatever services or goods or research we're producing. Then you have a third layer of research, and that is more public, which is research produced to inform programming. That trend started with the women organizations. A lot of the women-led organizations or women organizations working on issues of gender equality, women empowerment, etc., produced a huge wealth of knowledge that they eventually used to inform their programming inside the country with Syrian women, but also with Syrian women outside the country, whether in neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, or even beyond in Europe or the US. That trend also moved to other right-based organizations, including the organization that I manage, Baytna, where now, before launching any major sub-granting call, we commission a research to basically inform us on what are the priorities, inform us what are the intervention points that we should be looking at, and we make that research public, available for everyone to use. And we also make that research part of the call for proposal that we launch. But we're not the only organization that is doing this. Several sub-granting mechanisms on Syria are doing the same thing. Last but not least, you have the research that is being produced for the sake of research, or knowledge that is being produced just for knowledge. A lot of that comes from media / citizen journalists that moved away from traditional media or new media and dedicated more of their time into looking at the question of knowledge production and started producing big studies on different topics related to the conflict or related to the current situation in the country. But not only media and citizen journalists, but general actors that are civic actors that are interested in the question have also started doing that. And when we looked at this trend, we actually started offering, as an organization, some sub-grants that are research specific and basically provide funding to people interested to produce knowledge at the local level, at the grassroots level. So these are kind of the different types of knowledge that is being produced by the different actors. How is it being used? Well, first, as I mentioned, it was being used to report back to donors. It's also being used to inform programming. It's used to definitely build advocacy campaigns and lobbying. But it's also used to disseminate knowledge as widely as possible among local populations, especially when we're talking about grassroots produced knowledge. And in terms of challenges, the big question is the legitimacy question. Obviously, The entities that are producing these knowledge are not well-established entities. These are entities that at most are 5 to 6 years old, that do not necessarily have any recognition in terms of sound methodology or sound accreditation, etc. And third, it's the issue of acceptance. The fact that you're producing knowledge while a conflict is ongoing, you will automatically be seen as biased. That might not necessarily be a problem. Sometimes you want to be biased, but in terms of acceptance of that knowledge produced, it becomes a question. Who is going to read this? Are you going to be able to target the different audiences that you want to target? So if you're producing, and I'll give an example, if you're producing a research on the needs of women in Syria, and if this research is led by an organization based in the northwest of the country, how accepted the findings of that research would be by women in Damascus or women in Sueda or in Latakia, etc. Because automatically these women will go and look at who wrote this and where they come from, etc. So you have all the conflict dynamics, all the conflict elements come into the evaluation and the acceptance of any form of knowledge that is produced at the grassroots level. Even if the knowledge itself and the quality is sound and is bulletproof, is encompassing, is inclusive, etc. It's not about that. It's all about perception, and it's about conflict dynamics and how these are impacting the quality of the information you're generating. You also have that same or similar problem when you're trying to use that knowledge produced in lobbying or in advocacy. Because depending on who you're targeting, they might accept or not the findings out of the locally produced knowledge where it's produced. So let's say meeting with a Russian official trying to convince Russia of a certain endeavor in Syria, and all the research material that we're using is produced in the northwest of the country. Again, they will immediately be dismissive without looking at how sound or bulletproof that knowledge is. So the politics not only reflect locally, but also reflect internationally when you're trying, to use that locally produced knowledge to effect policy change. It is most successful when you're working with a Western audience, whether we're talking about the United States, the UK, the EU and EU member states, etc. Then, they're more accepting of that locally produced knowledge, even if it's not necessarily coming from, an organization that they necessarily recognize or an organization that they basically support. Your ability to influence policy making is highest when it comes to Western countries and Western policy circles. And it's lowest, and you'll be surprised, when it comes to Arab circles. Arab countries and Arab institutions do not accept simply the concept of non-state produced knowledge. It's very hard to or something that is not coming from well-established research centers or academia. It's very hard to convince Arab governments and Arab policymakers to engage on a policy discussion with non-state actors or non-academia actors or non-research actors. And it's been extremely challenging. It's even more challenging to engage them than to engage the Russian government or to engage the Chinese government. Although most of that, and interestingly, most of that research is produced in Arabic, it's not produced in English or in French or in Russian or whatever it is in Chinese. Most of that material is actually, the prime language of it is Arabic. And the last thing I want to say on that specific issue around public policy and public and trying to affect change is, how is this research also used to influence or to lobby international organizations, whether it's the UN or other international organization actors in Syria? I think the UN is the main target, given that it has the largest presence in Syria, well, whether it's UNDP or WHO or WFP, or trying to work with New York or the Amman hub, the regional hub in Amman, et cetera, to be able to, you know, influence the Syria humanitarian report, or to be able to influence the different development plans that are being put together, or to work with ASQA, for example, in Beirut on all the policy recommendations or policy gap analyses that they're making on the Syria conflict. And there, I think the UN has been fairly accepting of all the information and knowledge that they've been fed, but the impact is very, very small. We almost don't see it. So there's this question among Syrian circles is of, why are we doing this? I mean, if yes, the information is welcomed, the knowledge is welcomed, we're being received at the highest levels, but then nothing happens, right? It most probably disappears into a drawer of some clerk, and that's the end of it. So that's really the fourth element in terms of the different challenges that we face. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Asad, a lot. As you can see, the presentation complements what Farah basically has introduced. In a sense, we're looking at the other side of the spectrum, which is what we're calling the locally produced knowledge, and how is it received or not, whether at the level of the policy or at the level of international, let's call them internationally produced knowledge, such as the World Bank, and what impact do the local knowledge producers have on this internationally produced knowledge. So again, I'm sure it will we will have a lot of questions. I'm already receiving some questions. I'll make sure to address them after Ola's presentation. Ola, you're next, please. And thanks, Asad, for this very interesting presentation as well. Ola?
Thank you, Jamil. Thank you, ARI team, for giving me the opportunity. And I really am enjoying this discussion because probably for the first time, we are studying knowledge rather than just producing knowledge. So I'll share my screen today. I'll talk about a case study, probably as an example. So it will be an example that complements what Farah and Asad discussed. Lessons learned and good practices in state and non-state actors' communication in the SDGs policy making in Lebanon. For those who don't know, Lebanon committed voluntarily to the SDGs in September 2015. The project started in mid-2017, and it was something new. For the policymakers, the agenda was new. It was still learning by process, whether it is for the UN system itself or for the countries themselves. If you want to go quickly a step back for a historic briefing, efforts for national development in Lebanon were always fragmented. They were minimal. Sustainable development was not very well understood by policymakers, and the strategies were either local or initiated by ministries or fragmented, as I said. And then this new concept came within the context of a new global UN-led agenda Also, Lebanon was processing or proceeding with the Sadr reforms plan that was also had in its components some social and developmental pillars, some mobilization of private sector resources. So there were some new elements in this project, and there was a start to think at the government level for a national social protection ecosystem, because the Sadr reform, it was considered as a strict reform. I mean, Lebanon needed some strict reforms, so there was the initiation of thinking about an ecosystem that considers development, sustainable development, social development, etc. So within this framework, the institutional framework to set or to launch this SDGs and implementation of the Agenda 2030 that called for a whole of government and whole of society approach. So it was kind of a mess for policymakers and for the civil society. Everybody wants to be on board, how to be on board, what is the role of each, where do we start? And I can say from a personal experience, something that I learned over breakfast from the international community a few years ago is that the UN system was aware of the difficulty of starting with a whole of government approach, let alone whole of society approach. So they were aware of this difficulty, and they believed that some countries will not be able to effectively reach whole of society approach. And then when COVID came, it blew up the past track, and then there was a whole reshifting in decision making and in planning and in how to introduce and communicate between both parts. So what happened in Lebanon, there was an establishment of a national committee for SDGs that officially included state and non-state actors. What I mean by state actors, it means ministries and public administrations. Non-state actors, they were representatives of the private sector, there were 2 people, and representatives of civil society, there were also 2 people. These people, they represented their institutions, their organizations, they represented their sectors. They did not represent their organizations or themselves. So whether we like them or not, their role was to represent their sectors. This national committee was included more than 50 people. So the best way to do things was to decompose it into groups. The government considered the 5 pillars that the UN system also launched, which is people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. However, because Lebanon believed that partnerships is part of the system, of this, the political system in Lebanon, regardless of how inefficient or efficient it is, and we needed to work more on statistics and improving data. So the 5th pillar was a cross-cutting task force for SDGs statistics. So at the launch of the SDGs agenda and VNR process, the VNR is the Voluntary National Review, which is the report that where the government states its status and where it wants to go and what development plans it has. There were different limitations. There was a time limitation, 7 months almost, and this was considered a limitation by many countries. And there was a budget limitation because the UNDP Lebanon office was the supporting arm in terms of budgeting for this project. However, the budget was not up to expectations. So they had to cut out the part that involves the gap analysis. So the work, the consultancy work for the preparation of the VNR was restricted to a screening of the situation rather than a deep gap analysis. So as I said, we had UNDP for technical assistance capacity building, as well as other UN system agencies. So talking now about the non-state actors within this process, as I said earlier, they were private sector and civil society organizations. They represented their sectors. The government gave them full autonomy to draft their own sections in the VNR. Other countries, developed countries, did not have this luxury. What private sector and CSOs in Lebanon did, they criticized the government, they stated their own points of view. Everything was put as it is in the VNR report. And they had tailored trainings and awareness raising workshops because they needed to understand what this agenda is and what is their role. And they had one representative who participated in the official delegation to the UN High-Level Political Forum in 2018 in New York, where countries present their reports. And during their process, they had their own challenges within their communities in terms of understanding of the agenda, reaching out, etc. So the situation in Lebanon for like 5-6 months was that we're talking about an ambitious global agenda that calls for localization. And we're talking whole of government and whole of society. And we're talking a VNR process that is government-led, but it also calls for partnerships. And we have kind of a misunderstanding probably, or different logic when it comes to policies between state and non-state actors. The state mostly goes for sectoral development, while non-state actors go for thematic development. So it's like talking land and sea at the same time. And this created some tension, some chaos. So this also raised to the top mutual resistance between both parties. To explain it further, state actors tend to be more pragmatic and they go for low-hanging fruits when they want to design a policy and implement it, because they have political agendas, because there are political challenges, time constraints, and they are bounded by the administrative procedures and legislation. On the other hand, non-state actors tend to have disruptive ideas to the norms that are used by state actors. They think about development holistically. They consider everything and everybody, and they are keen that development reaches every person. Usually, they don't trust the state system. And at the same time, often or sometimes there are some activists or civil society organizations that criticize, and it is their right, but they do not provide doable alternatives. So given this difference in the logic and in the language, there was a need for proper communication between these two sides of the story. So we need to set proper communication dynamics, and we need to understand who is informing who what. Because as I said earlier, everybody wants to be on board of this project, and sometimes it happened that state actors saw that this process is a duplication of work that's already being done. So why are we repeating it again? Why are we asked to have other stakeholders on the table? So all of these challenges are legitimate and they needed to be addressed. To be practical, mitigation measures that took place back then, the first and primary one was following UN guidelines for the UN process, by whether by following trainings, tutorials, reports, and all the outcomes were utilized in the stakeholder engagement process in order to reach the VNR. Also, there was a lot of peer learning from other countries' experiences, regional or international, and mostly from countries that are similar to Lebanon, because there were common grounds with such countries rather than seeking like Canada or Germany all the time. The government established a website to be more transparent and to put all what it's doing there, and a dedicated email that was initially used for circulation of communication between state stakeholders, in addition to the official hard copies, because communication in the government cannot be paperless, but we started to have discussions by emails. And there was a lot of dialogue about ensuring the national ownership of the VNR at the institutional level. So entities, public institutions would not feel afraid that somebody is conquering them, that the UN system is conquering them. It is their product, it is their knowledge, it is their policies, and it is the credit is for them. And then also there was emphasis that the VNR, the first VNR and the only so far, was a stock-taking exercise to capture what's being done, what's in the pipeline, what still needs to be done, and what are the challenges in terms of development. So yes, it did not display a national development policy. It was the grassroots work that would be used to be and to build on it in order to move to development policies. But then the crisis happened in Lebanon. So other communication challenges between these two main stakeholders, the state and the non-state, more awareness and knowledge creation about the Agenda 2030 and was needed, and about what it means to think national sustainable development policy making, what is meant to think thematically rather than sectoral wise. There was some resistance towards the consultant's work. Why is she there? Why is she asking? Why is the UN intervening? All of that. So there was a need for a less offensive approach, whereby a letter, an official letter was sent to them that you will have a consultant coming, asking some questions, etc. Documents will be needed, etc. There were guiding questions that were prepared for the consultant for state and non-state actors. Also in communication, sometimes the institutions themselves either didn't have enough time probably, or capacity or knowledge to really answer the question as it is, but rather they would just send the whole document. So this is not what we want. We are asking for precise information. And there were sometimes delays in responses, and micro follow-up was needed. What's important in the Lebanese process, and this is something that was reflected by the international community, reflected on by the international community, which is the validation process. So when the consultant gathered the information and analyzed it from different entities under each SDG and synthesized, then it was resent to these administrations so that they see their input within the bigger picture, bigger context. And this created or showed a lot of loopholes in coordination of policies between ministries, probably duplication, probably they were not aware that other administrations are doing something that complements their work. So this was really very important in terms of communication and in terms of improving the quality of knowledge that is being created. As for the non-state actors, as I said, guiding questions and workshops were prepared, and they also had their own challenges in terms of time limitation, different levels of understanding of the agenda and of development policy making, difficulties in accessing their own contact details. So lessons learned from the process, and these are what were done and what need to be repeated. Always abide by UN guidelines, which are updated according to countries' needs. The validation exercise is really important, as I explained, and always engage effectively non-state actors in all the process, including going in the official delegation to the UN. Lessons learned to be considered later on. We need to have more open dialogue between state and non-state actors from the inception of any project, to be based on mutual trust and good faith in each other's interests and limitations. And non-state actors need to be more involved in the 5 groupings of the committee. We also need to improve capacity building, as I said, in the developing the mindset of policy making. We need to strengthen the role of statistics, primarily the Central Administration for Statistics. We need to involve public entities, and entities that have interdisciplinary profiles, that have some civil actors on their boards, in order to have more inclusive and holistic approach to planning. We need to allocate more budgeting for the situation analysis and start the process as early as possible. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hala. Again, I personally enjoyed this, what we can call case study. I just, maybe I should flag up that all these presentations do not represent any institutions, and our speakers here are just speaking in terms of their capacity as researchers or consultants, and not representing UN or the government or any other institution. So the case presented just now by Ola, it's again it complements Farah's and As'ad's presentation, whereby we're looking at the case where we're producing a report whereby we have to abide by the international requirements, but also we possibly need to navigate the national intricacies, political or not, tension between non-state and state actors. And that was very insightful in a sense that we're looking now possibly at the internal cuisine of how these national reports are being produced, what are the challenges, but also mechanisms to unlock possible obstacles. So, so we have three very rich presentations. I have also questions. I'll possibly address the questions, and I can give you the floor to answer. So the first question I have is by Mohammed Kambris. Actually, Mohammed has many questions. First one is, I'm gonna read and quote, this analysis, I believe the one by Farah, uses what many believe to be neo-colonial institutions as a source of knowledge, with the public as a target. What about the knowledge that the public is producing? Farah, you answered, but also possibly we need maybe to answer the general public here. I'll have another question by Mohammed as well. What do you think about using a unifying platform, a mobile app, for example, that constantly polls its users on the central ideas of the research of different grassroots organizations? Would this bring more research legitimacy? Maybe this is a point addressed to As'ad, who talked about legitimacy, public awareness, and an approach that is more bottom-up. I had a question by Sarah Ajel Yaqeen, but I guess I can no longer see it. Okay, here it is. So Sarah asks the following question. I found Farah's intervention problematizing theories of change as analytical conceptual frameworks very interesting. What are the underlying assumptions about the nature and direction of causal influence between them? What are the ideological claims, foreign ministry strategies, budget line, and very operational definitions of results and impact? I wonder what the effect of this on the long run will be on the status of knowledge production as a public good in our region, especially after a decade very much born into radical claims to change. Okay. So I possibly leave the floor now for answers, and then we'll take a second round of questions. And again, I need to possibly mention that for those of you who have questions, we're taking the Q&As in the chat box. Maybe we start with As'ad, then Farah, then Ola. As'ad.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jamil, and thank you, Mahmoud, and for your question. It's very hard to see how we can make knowledge accepted or legitimate. Could an app that is constantly polling be an answer? It's part of the answer, but it's not all the answer, because obviously you always have to clean that data that you'll be collecting. And therefore the data analysis and the data mining becomes a nightmare if you're constantly polling and not knowing exactly who is responding. I mean, that's the other issue that we face, especially in our region, given how politicized everything is that how true or how representative is that answer to that poll, and that's a huge challenge. But definitely technological solutions are part of the answer, mobile apps, constant polling, but also I think we need a way to develop a culture of acceptance, and that's another thing where basically we need to make our residents and citizens understand that knowledge is important, knowledge is influential, and knowledge basically drives policy. And once we start linking that and making the fact that polling and you know the different techniques that are being used, whether it's polling, key informant interviews, focus group discussions, etc., all of these are tools to evaluate and to be able to generate that data, are legitimate, are not things that we're doing because we are agents of the CIA or because we are agents of I don't know, the DGSE in France, because that's the other element of it. You get accused all the time whenever you're working on field research is that you're collecting data to feed into I don't know which foreign intelligence, and there's that link as well that needs to be broken and to be able to fully utilize and fully benefit from the information being gathered.
Okay, thanks, Asad. Farah?
Yes, thank you, Jamil. So I'll be first addressing Mahmoud's knowledge produced by UN organizations mainly and IFIs, but this is not to dismiss knowledge produced elsewhere. It is a fact that these organizations spend a decisive budget on knowledge research production, especially in the Arab region. And so my intervention aimed to actually look into some of the assumptions made by these organizations when attempting to produce knowledge. So again, it's not dismissive, but then I also have a question on knowledge produced by the public. There is, I don't know what Mahmoud means by that, but I think there is also a few misconceptions around knowledge that is generated using, for example, AI, big data, which claims to be generating research and knowledge on the biggest population possible. Like, for example, using social media posts, generating analysis and research using social media posts, using web analytics, etc. Because at the end of the day, we do need to remember that this is a region whereby, yes, internet connection in the GCC has reached 100%. It hasn't reached more than 60% in some countries. So who is connected, who has access to internet connection, who knows how to use a mobile app, etc. This remains relevant to this side of the world. Sarah, I think I have a few questions by Sarah. So on the theory of change, I was actually highlighting that the fact that it is a problematic operational framework. So rather than, for example, let's say we want to address and produce research on violent extremism, preventing violent extremism. This is something that our region was, for some time was under the spotlight. We needed to deliver on violent extremism. We needed to deliver and produce knowledge. Who are extremists? Why are they becoming extremists, etc. But then rather than using like frameworks that look into violence, that looked into, the production of violence in societies, rather than, making use of sociology, etc., we end up adopting an operational framework that is about theory of change to prevent violent extremism. They identify a few assumptions around this phenomenon, and then the focus is actually on the interventions. So how can we de-radicalize societies, etc. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily bad. I'm saying that this is problematic if it is not twinned with the use of academia, the use of theoretical orientations, the use of analytical methodologies that look into the nature of humans. Are we by nature violent, etc.? Factors drive societies to become violent, etc. So this is just trying to showcase why I meant that the theory of change can be problematic if it dismisses the use of theories produced by other disciplines. Over to you.
Maybe Ola?
Thank you, Jamil. I have a few small comments, probably related to the challenges and limitations of producing knowledge from a practitioner's point of view. The first one is, are we producing knowledge or designing a policy top-down or bottom-up? If bottom-up, which is probably more representative, but it's probably becomes, creates fatigue for the beneficiaries or for the community. Also, what Farah said at the beginning of her presentation, who's producing the knowledge, when it is produced, and within what context. This is really important. Dialogue between state and non-state actors is really important, because at the end of the day, we need to complement each other's work, given limitations on budget, timing, capital, knowledge. Everybody, I mean, the governments, they need to produce knowledge and they need to implement. So whereas the mandate of a think tank or a research agency is just to produce knowledge. So there is a constraint on the human capital and on the timing and budget of the implementing agencies. Also, when being in a situation of protracted crisis, things become more difficult in terms of and here I'm not defending anyone, I'm just talking realistically. The quality of the policy itself or the quality of the knowledge produced is affected by the situation, whether you have political stability or you are in a crisis situation or you need to act fast, and do you have the capability of having people of different mindsets on board or not. This may not be a good practice, but this is a realistic practice that needs to be thought of, and in order to find solutions to this problem. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So I have a set of questions related to language. The first one is, and I believe this is very important, we're discussing knowledge as a public good in the MENA region and discussing this in English. What is the role of language in democratizing knowledge? It's a very relevant question, often because all these reports are published in English. There is another question on language also. Does using the language principles and research produced by international organizations further the narratives that they are an extension of? For example, is there really such a thing as an international community? And there is a question on what narratives are the members and researchers at ARI trying to co-author. Actually, I'd like to say here on behalf of ARI that this is an exercise that we're already undertaking, exactly to publish pieces in a book or online on these questions that knowledge is when knowledge is produced outside the university, outside the academia, such as the one we're discussing now. So some of these interventions will be published online and in a book. I have another two questions. What efforts have been done to popularize or democratize knowledge and data? And finally, are there any efforts to have knowledge co-produced and co-created by organizations on the local, national, and international level? And this somehow joins Ola's case, because I have a question directly addressed to Ola. Ola, you talk about communication between state and non-state actors in a case like Lebanon, where the state is nearly non-existent and widely considered as illegitimate. How does this affect information and knowledge production as well? So maybe we start with Ola and then Farah and then Asad. Ola, please.
Thank you, Jamil. Well, first, let me remind the esteemed audience is that the VNR process was in 2017, 2018, so before the crisis. So whether, I don't know if it was back then considered a legitimate government or not. What Lebanon or what the government did back then was something innovative in terms of the classic way of doing business. Civil society and private sector were officially, by a decree from the Council of Ministers, members of the National Committee. The process was very, I don't want to say cumbersome, but it was very complicated. It was a large process with a short period of time. So there were many stages of coordination that needed to be done along the years. But unfortunately, Lebanon could not proceed because the crisis occurred in 2019 and the whole project stopped. Even the UNDP stopped the funding. So legitimate or not, this is a debatable question. This is what I was saying at the beginning. There is mistrust, there is mutual resistance from each party to listen and to hear the other. Emphasizing dialogue with good faith and good intention between both state and non-state actors is really important in order to reach common grounds that have mutual benefit for the people. And here I also want to stress on one thing, that it is really important to realize that there are good cadres and a human capital in the public administrations. There are some really hardworking people, very knowledgeable. They do a lot of trainings even outside Lebanon. So, and it's important to acknowledge when these people are working on some projects.
Great, thanks, Hala. Farah?
Yes, I think the question on knowledge is a very important one, and probably in our future interventions, I'll be talking in Arabic. But then there are two points here. There is the question of using our language, so Arabic, and then there is a second question, which is also this assumption that any pan-Arab research is by default political, has a political agenda. So the EU, I mean, there is a whole process whereby the EU reached where it is in terms of agreeing that it is a political entity, etc. In the Arab region, we've experienced that a couple of times, but it hasn't really materialized. But then, so this is in terms of the Arab becoming a political platform or a political entity. But then in terms of research, what the Arab Reform Initiative is doing is actually producing pan-Arab research or regional research. And there are others. There is also the Arab Opinion Index by the research institution that is affiliated with the Qatari government. There is also other initiatives at the level of academic institutions. The Arab Barometer is one. So we do have that. But then the language, the use of language is different. And I think it relates very much to what Assad was doing, to actually facilitate, empower locally produced knowledge, to admit that knowledge produced by at the grassroots level is knowledge that is worth integrating, worth finding a channel to reach upwards in terms of impact on policy making, in terms of advocacy, etc. And then also, eventually with the use of AI, part of this ChatGPT, the use of AI and big data, it is meant to democratize knowledge. But there exists parallel research which has been arguing also that this AI generated, decentralized generated knowledge is in fact very discriminatory. It does you know, it is based on what exists online, what is documented online. And this is by nature dominated by other languages. It is also by nature dominated by case studies that, for example, underrepresent ethnicities, underrepresent gender as well. So there was a big case also about, you know, the Google trends analysis, which was very much racist, which was very much, you know, underrepresentative, etc. So there is, you know, the controversy around democratization of knowledge is interesting to follow. And then, but there is a need for us to produce and publish more in Arabic, so that online we gain a bigger presence. Thank you.
Thanks, Farah. But before I give Ola and Asad the floor, Anna, personally, this is my personal opinion. I believe the language of communication is not restricted to English or Arabic. Is way more than that. It's to what extent it does reflect the reality or the complexities of the region, speaking from the region or on behalf of the region or for the region. So, and I believe at ARI, all articles that are published on the website are published in both English and Arabic. Same for this webinar, where there is also a translation into Arabic. So I see language more than just the language as per English or Arabic, also the language as per the realities that we like to interpret or transfer to the other recipient of the other. So Ola now and Asad for the opposite opportunity.
Thank you, Jamil. Actually, when I finalized my presentation, I realized that I didn't write it in Arabic because I thought that it should have been in Arabic. I totally agree with the fact that in order to promote our research and knowledge and to give it the value or credibility in the international community, it would be better to have it in English. But this is something that probably is related to the media and the culture that we've been living in for the past decades. But I strongly advocate producing knowledge in Arabic for our region, because it will help the knowledge to reach out to as many people as possible in terms of different levels of their education, and also to preserve the culture of the language as a scientific language and as a policy-making language as well.
Great. Asad, please.
Yeah, very quickly on the issue of language, most of the locally produced, grassroots produced knowledge is actually produced in Arabic. But the problem comes is, I absolutely agree with you, Farah, and Jamil, when we're talking about the region, when we're talking on behalf of the region, language does not matter. But when we're talking to the region, that becomes the issue. So the fact that we're speaking English because it's easier, because we're used to speak English in policy circles. We're used to speaking English whenever we're in a policy discussion, or whenever we're talking about research, etc. And that is the challenge of the Arabic language altogether. It has not moved. It has not adapted to the realities of modern days. It has not adapted to the possibility of creating policy knowledge, policy recommendations, doing gap analysis in Arabic. We do this in English, and then we translate into Arabic, and then the translation usually goes past the post. So we have a challenge with the language itself, with Arabic, and Arabic needs to move, I think, beyond that. But locally produced, grassroots produced knowledge is already in Arabic. It's not reaching downstream mainly because of, I guess, the political content, the conflicts that live in the region, and the perception that whatever grassroots produced knowledge is necessarily affiliated or biased, and therefore would only be accepted by the people or the community where that knowledge was produced. And I think one of the ways to go around this is creating these partnerships among the region between think tanks, civil society organizations, and academia. And I think that does not exist at the moment. It's very hard to do in Syria. Obviously, I'm not going to go to the Damascus University or Aleppo University and ask them to co-author or work with us on anything. But there are, I mean, academia is not limited to one country. We can look at the region as a whole and try to see what are entry points there, whether, you know, my alma mater comes to mind always, AUB, but it doesn't have to be AUB either. In AUC, other universities in the region, King Fahd University in Saudi, Doha, Qatar, the Arab Center, the Doha Institute, etc. I mean, all of these are things, potentials that we need to investigate and look at to see how can we create these synergies and partnerships in order to democratize and make that information more widely accepted and more widely available.
Excellent, excellent. I guess it's about time to wrap it up. I personally enjoyed this discussion a lot. I just remind you all that this is a project that tries to unpack knowledge, the producers of knowledge, whether international, national or local. And the webinar today introduced these different actors, the challenges, and the opportunities. I'm sure we have a lot of interesting points that were raised. I just, you know, mention one that Ola flagged it up, which is the one related to state employees. We often have this idea that only the experts, international, are very good, are brilliant, they know what they're doing, as opposed to the local, national, state employee who is not serious or does not have enough knowledge to produce this kind of knowledge. This is a clear example that it's not always the case, on the contrary. So we should also not give up on the state completely. I'm talking about the case of Lebanon, especially when the state, you know, is depicted as being collapsed. On the contrary, we should possibly work with these public employees to revive whatever public sector we still have or we aim to have. Again, I thanks Farah, Ola, and Asad for this very rich conversation, and thanks for the audience for attending, for asking questions. I'll take this opportunity to announce our next webinar, which is going to be on teaching public policy in the Arab region, whereby we're going to discuss how we teach public policy and whether all the canon is based on Western literature, or we can have or include case studies from the region, again, to see how we can shed light on the fact that we want to speak for the region and not necessarily to the region. So we're going to explore how academia covers this or not. Thank you again for your attendance. Thanks for the speakers, and wish you happy holidays.
Thank you, Jamil and Ari team.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.